In today's show, I'm going to be covering the best players who have changed teams so far in the NBA offseason. Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast as Obi tries to leave. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_Beeble, on TikTok at redrock_Beeble, and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Thank you for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free. We are available on all platforms. On yesterday's show, at the start, I talked about my plans for the coming week because by the time you listen to this, I am one day away from heading away. So I talk about, TikTok and YouTube Shorts, so we'll do some recaps on Summer League there. I am recording this show on the 2nd of July at about 10 p.m. Eastern. So there might be moves that have happened by the time this gets released that aren't included here. But I think this is just a nice little show that I can get some stuff out in advance that makes a little bit of sense. And what this show isn't, it's not me telling you who the best players are going to be for fantasy in the next season, because I haven't sat down and done all the projections on that to give you that idea. What this is telling you is the best players from last year, which ones changed teams. Who are the best players from fantasy last year that changed teams? Is their stock up? Is their stock down? Looking at the top 7 players that have changed teams, as well as, I think, another 7 players or so who are probably going to change teams. And I can't tell you if their stock is up or down because it hasn't happened yet. But that's what we're doing here on this show, is going through the best players from last season who have changed teams. And in saying all of that, let's get into the guys that we don't know about yet before you ask that question. Michael Bolton. Not Michael Bolton. Warney. Sorry.
Let's get it on, Gilly.
All right. I've got 6 names here that were top 120 fantasy players last season that are either likely to move or are unresolved free agents. If I was doing this list and I knew that Damian Lillard had been moved, he would be the best fantasy player to change teams. And if he ends up in Miami, then his fantasy stock will definitely be down. He will have an impact on the other guys on that team as well, in Jim Butler and Bam Adebayo. But because I don't know who is moving and coming back and who's going where or where Lillard's going or anything, it's very hard to know that. But he would be. I created a list of 13 players for this exercise, and they were all top 120 guys. I think they were all top 120 guys. Let me double check that. The last player on that list, was he top 120? He was, yes, top 120 players. They're all top 120 players. There was 13 players who either have changed teams or could change teams. Lillard would have been number 1, but I don't know where he's going. The James Harden situation remains unresolved. Harden would have been number 2 on this list. And I would expect, like Lillard, that if he does change teams and move to, say, with the favorites with the Clippers, and I don't really know how that's going to work with Russell Westbrook there. Okay, that's a little weird. But anyway, his value would go down playing alongside Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. It would impact George quite a bit as well. Harden would probably have double-digit assists again and lead the league in that number, but his overall usage would probably take somewhat of a hit. It wouldn't be that big, and he might actually remain higher than what his hit might be smaller than what Lillard's is, but it's dependent on where Harden goes. But I don't really see a scenario where Harden's value jumps significantly. If he had have gone to Houston, probably, but he didn't. So Harden, it would have been second on that list. I don't know about Tyler Hero.
Everyone has a hero.
True.
0 people shouldn't have a hero.
Tyler Hero would have been 7th in my group of 13 players in terms of where they ranked. And I am starting to transition more into talking -1 overall ranks. He would have been 7th on that list. He might not get traded, but there's a lot of talk of him being a part of this deal that could bring Damian Lillard to Miami. I don't think he would end up in Portland. It doesn't make any sense for him to go to Portland, but there's talk he might go to Brooklyn. He would definitely start in Brooklyn. And if he went to Brooklyn, playing alongside Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson, I think his value probably rises. But I don't know. I don't know if Hero A moves or B where he moves. But he would be on this list as one of the best 7 players that would change teams. And, but we don't know where he goes. The other guys wouldn't have been included in my best 7 players from last year, but they are worthy just players to discuss. The Crucifix, Christian Wood, he would have been 8th on this list. I have no idea where he's going to go, and I feel really good about the fact that he's not going to play quite as much as he did last season. So I'm not sure that he's going to be draftable, but that still is obviously a gigantic question considering we don't know where he's going to end up. PJ Washington Jr. was 11th on my list. With the returning of Miles Bridges, the drafting of Brandon Miller, you would have to think that Washington's minutes upside is nowhere near where it was last season. So even as a restricted guy, the odds would suggest he is back in Charlotte. And then if that's the case, then his value plummets. It's way down. And he's probably not draftable. Maybe he goes to another team. I don't know how the mechanics work. If somehow he gets folded in to get to Miami to be their starting power forward, I actually like that for him. But he was one of the top 11 players that probably can change teams, but he also might not. And then the other guy whose destination is unresolved, who was a top 120 player last season, that was Kelly Oubre Jr., Washington's teammate in Charlotte. He would have been the last player on this list. I don't know where he's going to go, and I would say almost unreservedly that he will be worse than he was last season. I don't see what team is allowing him to be the number 1 option, scoring 20 points per game and playing 30 minutes a night. Who's signing him to do that? Where's he even going in general? He's probably just going to be a 25 to 28 minute a night bench player, but I don't know. So they're the guys that could have been considered for this list. I guess Wood, Washington, and Oubre wouldn't have been because they were down the bottom, but they were just in this group, and I just wanted to look at all the guys from that top 120, 13 of them, who have the likelihood to change teams. Now, there might be someone else that comes in a random trade, like a Zach LaVine, perhaps, or do they move DeMar DeRozan? Like those sort of players, they could end up on a new team. And that's just something that's sort of completely out of the blue, if that's what ends up happening. But these are, now, we'll get into the top 7 players from fantasy last season who changed teams. But before I do that, today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp, we know that in life we're faced with tough choices. And the path forward, it isn't always clear. You might be thinking, what do I do with work? What do I do with this relationship? What do I do with a parenting decision, dealing with schools or discipline or family members? There's so many things that can happen in life, and we don't always have the answers. No one always has the answers. That's where therapy can help. Whether you're dealing with decisions around career, relationships, or anything else, therapy helps you stay connected to what you really want while you navigate life so you can move forward with confidence and excitement. Trusting yourself to make decisions that align with your values is like anything. The more you practice it, the easier it gets. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge, which is really important. If you don't have rapport with your therapist, well, you're not going to get anything out of it. So BetterHelp enables you to just switch to someone who is better suited to you. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. That will bring us into the best player from last season who is now on a new team. And that player is... Kristaps Porzingis, who had a really strong season. If you are watching this on YouTube, a few numbers up there. I've got the -1 rank, which is basically, do I call it -1? I think I am, but it might be more accurate to call it best 7. It's just how you would rank if you included the players' best 7 fantasy categories. On a per game basis, he was 19th in that, and on a total basis, I know that the hit on Porzingis has always been injuries. He was 22nd, and he also had fake injuries for the last week or so, the final 6 games, whatever, with the Wizards tanking. That number would have been higher. He averaged almost 42.5 fantasy points, but again, if you are watching this on YouTube, you can see the big words at the top. Stock down. I should have created a stinger for this. Didn't. That's fine. Whatever. There's no way, I don't think, that Porzingis, who was the number 1 guy in Washington for big chunks of the season, Beal was there at times, but Porzingis almost had a 30 usage. It's just not going to be the case in Boston. He will be, at times, the number 2 guy with Jaylen Brown, but Tatum's the number one. So he's not going to get the usage. He might not play the same minutes. His value is definitely dipping. And then while we have been assuaged, well, not we, some have been assuaged a little in terms of the injury risk. That's, if you thought about Porzingis as an injury risk player before last season, surely 1 year where he didn't get hurt changes your mind. Now, you know how I feel about injuries and discussing that. But if you had that thought, I'm never touching him because he's always hurt, and then you don't do a full, I would hope, you don't do a full 180 on a bloke like that, plus the overall upside for him just from a per-game production standpoint has got to be lower in Boston. So I think his stock is down. He is still only 28. He moves from Washington to Boston. I think one of the things we'll see on this show as well, and something I tweeted about last week, I think it was, talking about with the new CBA. Also, by the way, all of the people shitting on CJ McCollum, Grant Williams, how you guys have killed the NBA. What a disaster. You did all this to get back at the Warriors. It's all just going to be max contracts and minimum salaries. You've killed all the players. What have you done? That clearly hasn't taken place, yeah? Like, that hasn't been a problem whatsoever. That was one person saying that, and then this snowball of memes rolling, saying how badly they cooked the players and they killed them and there's no middle class in the NBA. And again, through free agency, I think it's pretty clear that's not the case. The players are getting paid. There's no situation like that where there isn't a middle class. Players are still getting money. And those concerns are garbage, I think. I think they're garbage. And I think that's been shown so far. But back to my original point was that when I tweeted about this new CBA, I said, well, what I think it's going to do is it's going to end up making free agency a sort of dead event where the majority of players change teams through trades. Porzingis could have been a free agent, but he opted in and was traded. James Harden could have been a free agent, but he opted in and probably will be traded. Damian Lillard's not a free agent, but he's asking for a trade. And there's very few players, and even on this list, there's very few players who just were free agents and just exercised that right and said, I'm going to a new team. It just doesn't happen that much anymore. Teams will overpay players. They will sign them to contracts, retaining salary slots and ability to move guys through trades. Getting something is better for the players. And is it better for the players? It's better for the teams because you get something back if a player wants out versus Toronto, where they get nothing. They got nothing for many of these guys that leave. Free agency is just not. You think back to Kawhi going to the Clippers. Think back to Durant going to the Warriors. I just think that sort of stuff, at least for the short-term future, is dead. We're not going to get the big names hitting free agency through liberalized extension rules, through trades, through whatever, opt-in and trades. It just seems it's more about extensions. It's more about renegotiations than free agency. Porzingis' stock is down, but he was the best player so far that has changed teams. The second guy is Fred VanVleet, and he was really close to being the best player that changed teams. Now, he did move through traditional free agency. Goes from Toronto to Houston. He's 29. His stock is down, and let me explain that. Let's go through the fundamentals on him. He was 20th in -1 rank last season. He was 10th in -1 rank for totals. He averaged 40 fantasy points. Pretty good numbers. So why is his stock down? This is what I look at. He played 37 minutes a night per game last season, 36.8 to be exact, 38 the year before that. He didn't really play with high usage players. Like, Siakam's a sort of usage player. Scotty Barnes isn't a high usage player. OG Anunoby isn't a high usage player. VanVleet's not a super high usage player either, but it wasn't like he was out there with chuckers. He wasn't. Like, Siakam led the team in usage. Cool. But part of the appeal of VanVleet and Siakam and Anunoby to that degree is that their insane coach, Nick Nurse, would play them as many minutes as humanly possible. You would get big minutes out of these guys. Part of the other appeal is the scheme that Toronto would run defensively would really play into Fred VanVleet's ability to generate steals. 1.8 steals per game, 1.7, 1.7, 1.9 the last 4 years. It's not to say that he can't generate steals in Houston. He might still be able to. But going from 37, 38, 37 minutes the last 3 seasons, he had 22 usage. I'm not sure that sticks. I don't think he's a big drop-off, but Jalen Green's a pretty high usage player. Dylan Brooks is Not as high usage as you think he is, but he'll take some shots. Jabari Smith's going to get shots. Şengün's there. Kevin Porter coming off the bench. It's not a clear... If VanVleet is the best player on that team, I'm very comfortable in saying that. But it's not a clear case where he comes in and gets to shoulder this gigantic offensive load. He will probably, I would guess, stick at a similar usage. It might go up. Was it 23? It might go up. Maybe he averages 20 points. That's true. But there's a risk of defensive scheme impacting his defensive numbers, dropping them down. And if instead of playing 37 minutes a night, when you've got Kevin Porter who can play some point guard, and surely they will want to get some reps to Amen Thompson as a point guard as well. And again, no team plays guys these minutes apart from Tom Thibodeau and Nick Nurse.
I think he's talking to you.
Sorry, that was just a delayed Amen Thompson drop. I don't know why I did that. Now, Ime Udoka played some decent minutes to his players back in Boston, but I would say if we're going to set the minutes for Fred VanVleet, we look at 35 or maybe 34, especially given some of his injury problems and his size and the fact that you've got other capable guys who can handle that role. I'm not saying he's playing 30 a night or 32 or 33. It might be 35 minutes a night. Still a good number. But 37 to 35 without a absolutely super clear, gigantic bump in usage and an iffy defensive situation in terms of can those numbers come, I don't really see how VanVleet maintains. I think he's dropping. Let's go to another player who was in Washington, another player who was traded, and another player whose stock is going to go down. And that's Bradley Beal. Beal was 39th in -1 rank last season, 99th in totals, missed a ton of games. Hamstring issues, 37.8 fantasy points. He's 30. He moves to Phoenix. I see, look, the total numbers will probably jump up. He'll probably play more games, but there's no guarantee in that. He's had a lot of injuries. Some of them are fake because of the tanking in Washington, so some of those games played are definitely fake.
Fake.
But I'm not telling you he's a paragon of health. He's not. He's 30, and now he goes to a team where he was the number one usage option until Porzingis got more of that when Beal went out, to the third guy in Phoenix. And you haven't seen the show yet, but it is coming out next week about correlations with fantasy production. Usage is one of the big correlations, especially in points leagues. More usage, more fantasy points. That is the way it works. More usage, generally, better fantasy rank. So he's losing usage. Now, his efficiency might jump up because it's been pretty bad. That's true, but that's usually not enough to offset a usage drop. It's usually not enough. Beal might get more assists, but he was getting plenty of assists in Washington. I just can't see a way that his numbers go up. And given he was 39th, is he even a top 50 player next season? I really, really have my doubts. I don't think I'd be wanting to take him in that area. Again, don't know yet. A lot of things still to happen. But that's where we sit with him. But he was the third best player from last season who has changed teams at the time of me recording this. Another player who was traded, actually as a part of the same deal. Actually, and a part of another deal as well. Chris Paul. He moves from Phoenix via Washington to Golden State. Paul is 38 years of age. We all know this. He was -1 ranked 47th last season, 73rd in total, so actually more valuable totals than Beal, 8 years older. He averaged 36 fantasy points, but he goes to Golden State now. So, maybe he starts. Maybe it's Paul, Curry, Clay, Wiggins, Dre. There'll be plenty of nights off for Paul and for Curry and for Clay and maybe Draymond, but we also thought the same thing last year, and they were so bad that they couldn't afford to do that. So they didn't. And Chris Paul moves into Jordan Poole's slot in the rotation, but they didn't really start Poole that often. They're very different players, obviously. And in order to get the best out of a 38-year-old Chris Paul, I don't think you can play in the same minutes that you did last season. In fact, I'm not even sure that Chris Paul's a top 100 player next season. Don't know yet. But would they start him with Draymond at center, or they go with Looney? I'm not sure. Would they start Kuminga and Draymond together instead of Chris Paul, and Paul runs the bench unit, plays 25 a night, 60 games? They brought Corey Joseph in today for some reason. I don't know. Gary Payton's still there. Paul was the fourth best player to so far change teams last season. There's almost no way that he's a top 100. Well, not almost, but there's no way At 47th, there's no way I'd take him there. No way I'd take him in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th round. I might consider it in the 90s, especially if we get more clarity on what his role is. But overall, this is really a big fade, I think, on Chris Paul and his value next season. Now let's get to some players whose stock went up from last year. And again, it's a part of the same deal. Because Jordan Poole moves from Golden State to Washington as part of the Chris Paul deal. He's only 24, and despite some struggles last season, he was 84th in -1 rank. He was 35th in -1 totals, and he averaged 30.5 fantasy points. On this Wizards team, he is going to lead the team in usage, and if he doesn't hit 33 usage, him and Kuzma will fight over it. If he doesn't hit 33 usage, I think I'm going to be pretty surprised. If he got an average 27 points per game, I wouldn't be surprised. If he goes 27, 4 and 4, or 4 and 5, with a steal, with 4 threes, 90% from the line on 5 attempts, maybe shooting 41 from the field, that could be realistic. In -1 value, when you know you're punting field goals with him, that's probably a 3rd round player. I don't know that yet. I haven't broken it down, but that's probably where it is. So I will probably do another show at some point late July of who the biggest winners are overall over the offseason. We've seen more stuff happen. He's got to be one of them. He was the 5th best player on this list. 5th best player on this list last season. Yep. But and the first one who's going to gain value. And I don't really think there's any argument in that. His fantasy points, 30.5. They should smash through 40, I would guess. Probably close to a top 25 fantasy points guy, I would guess, next season. And he's only 24. So there's plenty of room for him to still actually get better, despite some of the playoff issues. It's going to be a huge guy to watch in terms of what his ADP comes out at. This next one, I wasn't really sure how to view it. Marcus Smart. He was 104th last season in -1 ranks. 121st in totals. He averaged 28 fantasy points. He's 29. He goes from Boston to Memphis. I think that his stock has gone up. And I'll tell you why that is. Last season, he started most games, playing next to Tatum and Brown, the big usage players on that team. But there was still Derek White. There was still Malcolm Brogdon there, who were touching the ball quite a bit. He goes to Memphis, where he will start undeniably. He will start the beginning of the season with Ja Morant out as their starting point guard. Not really sure who they're going to start in the other slot, because Dylan Brooks is gone. So it'd be Smart and Bane. I would guess next to Bane and Jaren that Smart fits in as 3rd usage option, pushing 2nd on some nights. Bane and Jackson are clearly, or probably Bane's going to be that. Bane might run 30 usage to begin the season, I think, in Memphis. Smart is going to be in a pretty great role early on, but when Ja does come back, Smart, I don't think he's moving to the bench. That wouldn't really make any sense to me. He will then fill the Dylan Brooks role, who was the guy that would start next to Bane and Morant. Smart, we know, can guard 1s, 2s, and 3s, even 4s. He can handle the ball as a secondary playmaker. Sometimes he can shoot 3s, and he can defend really well. They got some weird guys to sort of watch in terms of who might jump into a position that is vacated by Dylan Brooks when Morant is suspended. Like there's weirdly some hype about LaRavia. I like Jake LaRavia as a draft pick last season, but really disappointed. Luke Kennard probably is the guy that starts, to be honest, when Ja is out. But Smart is going to have the upper hand over both of those players once Ja returns. And while his value, he's 104th last year, Smart, he might be 60th while Ja is out. He might be 81st, or, that was a specific number, 81st, 85th, big Terrell Owens guy here, when Ja returns. I find it hard to think that his full season production is going to be worse than what it was last season, when he's going to smash through the first third of the season with bigger numbers. And even when this team is fully healthy, his role actually might be more favorable than what it was in Boston last season. And the last guy I'm going to talk about, I had a few people asking me, hey, I don't think you've really discussed the John Collins deal. I think I did somewhere. I think I talked about it somewhere. But I'll talk about it again now. I think John Collins' stock is up This is a guy that 3 years ago, was a top 20 sort of a player. Now, when they made those moves to acquire Dylan Gallinari, it was at the time, and I think Bogdanovic, people were drafting him at the turn of the first and second round. I was massively out on that. I think I had him down in the 40s and ended up being correct on it. But he's just getting consistently worse and worse and worse. That was with Gallinari and Capella arriving too. Now, he's never, I don't think, getting back to that number, but he's only 26. He was 119th in -1 last season. He averaged 26.5 fantasy points. He really struggled. His shot went from 36% from 3 down to 29% from 3. Big dip. I expect him going to Utah that he starts next to Larry Markkinen, next to Walker Kessler, taking the Kelly Olynyk starting role. He probably doesn't play 34 minutes a night. He might play 31 or 32. But in Atlanta, we saw Trey and DeJounte just absolutely dominate usage. And yes, Markkinen and Clarkson are there. Markkinen wasn't a 30 usage guy. He was like 25 last season. He wasn't that high. So Collins can get a couple more shot attempts, maybe a little bit more creativity from Will Hardy in the offense. And if the shot starts to make a little bit more sense, maybe he plays 32 minutes a night. And maybe Kelly Olynyk gets moved at some point and Collins gets some backup center minutes, which bumps his field goals, bumps his block rate up. I find it hard to think that John Collins will be worse than what he was last season. And I would have no problem on saying this July 3rd, my time, drafting John Collins in the top 100. I wouldn't go to top 50, but we will see when the numbers come out. This isn't the same Jazz team as last season where big opportunities arose for Olynyk, in particular Markkinen, and I was 40 spots ahead of ADP data on Markkinen, and it worked out. And I don't know where Collins is going to end up draft-wise, ADP, but I think he's going to step up, and I'd find it hard. I'd be hard-pressed to find an argument that would suggest that he's going to be worse than what he was last season. So they're my top 7 players. Not mine. They are the objective top 7 players who changed teams from last year's fantasy ranks. There's more free agent stuff coming tomorrow, talking about teams that got worse, teams that got better, and that can be an idea as well. Hey, you view the players on those teams, fantasy-wise. Teams that usually get better, guys can get squeezed. Teams that get worse, some players can step up. So we're going to do that tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow. Follow this podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and on the Odyssey app. Or on YouTube, thumb it up. Leave your comments down below. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.